Ladies and gentlemen, today we step back in time, into the rugged wilderness where the frontiersmen once roamed. These were not trained soldiers or modern explorers. One of the most essential, and now nearly forgotten, skills that frontiersmen mastered was the art of tracking. This wasn't just about following a set of footprints in the dirt. It was a deeply observational, almost instinctive skill that required patience, attention to minute detail, and a deep understanding of the behavior of wildlife. Imagine walking through a dense forest with no guide, no GPS, and no idea where your next meal is coming from. The frontiersmen would scan the ground for the smallest signs, a broken twig, a slight indentation in the soil, scattered feathers, or even a change in the scent of the wind. These weren't just random observations. They were clues, almost like reading a living map. They could tell if a deer had passed through recently by how fresh the tracks looked. If the edges of a hoofprint were crisp and the dirt inside was still moist, the animal wasn't far. If droppings were still steaming in the morning cold, it meant dinner might just be within reach. They could spot fur caught on bark, or a subtle trail where grass had been pushed down, a path made by an animal returning to a water source or bedding down in tall grass. But it wasn't just about finding food. Tracking also meant staying alive. Frontiersmen could recognize the claw marks of a bear or the low, dragging tail of a snake crossing a dusty trail. If they saw crows circling in the sky or heard coyotes howling in the distance, they knew something, dead or alive, was out there. The wilderness was filled with danger, and the ability to read these signs often meant the difference between life and death. Even more impressive, experienced trackers didn't just rely on sight. They used their ears to pick up on unnatural rustling, their nose to smell decaying flesh or musky animal scent, and even their gut feeling, developed over years in the wild, to sense when they were being watched. In modern life, we've lost the need for this deep sensory awareness. But for frontiersmen, tracking was survival. It was hunting, protection, navigation, and understanding the land all rolled into one finely tuned instinct. It connected them intimately with the natural world and turned the unknown into something knowable, something navigable. In the unforgiving wilderness, fire wasn't a luxury, it was survival. It provided warmth in freezing nights, cooked the food that kept muscles moving, purified water that could otherwise carry deadly bacteria, and kept wild predators at bay. But the frontiersmen didn't have the convenience of a lighter or a box of matches. Instead, they mastered the ancient and demanding skill of creating fire with their bare hands and primitive tools. Starting a fire without modern tools wasn't something anyone could do without training. It was a practiced art, passed down through generations. The most common methods included flint and steel, bow drills, and even fire pistons, each requiring technique, preparation, and patience. Using flint and steel, frontiersmen would strike a sharp piece of flint against high-carbon steel to create a spark. But a spark alone wasn't enough. They carried char cloth, a fabric pre-treated to catch fire from even the tiniest spark, and carefully placed it in a nest of tinder, often made from dry moss, shredded bark, or dried grass. Then came the gentle breath, coaxing the ember into a flame. The whole process demanded calm focus. One wrong move, and you'd have to start all over again. Even more difficult was the bow drill method, rubbing a spindle against a wooden baseboard using a bow to spin it rapidly. The friction would generate enough heat to create a tiny coal, which was then transferred to the tinder nest. It could take a frontiersman 15 to 30 minutes of consistent effort to produce fire this way, especially in damp or windy conditions. And yet, despite the hardship, this was a daily ritual, done often multiple times a day. Every fire built in the rain, every spark made with frozen fingers, was a small victory over nature's indifference. Frontiersmen understood their environment intimately. They knew which woods burned best, cedar, birch, pine, and which ones worked better for friction. They sought out dry kindling even in the middle of a downpour, knowing where to find dry bark beneath tree canopies or inside rotting logs. Starting a fire also required strategic thinking. Where to build it so it wouldn't get blown out by wind. How to shield it from rain. How to maintain it through the night without exhausting their fuel. These questions had to be answered correctly every time. To us today, lighting a fire is a simple flick of the wrist. But for the frontiersmen, it was a test of endurance, a symbol of self-reliance, and sometimes the only thing standing between life and death. Their fire-making skills were a cornerstone of survival, reliable, repeatable, and always ready when the wild turned hostile. In the vast, untamed wilderness where frontiersmen roamed, shelter was more than just a place to rest. It was the line between life and death. Whether facing a blizzard, torrential rain, or the scorching sun, a well-built shelter could mean the difference between surviving the night or falling victim to the elements. And remember, there were no tents, no sleeping bags, and no hardware stores. Every structure had to be crafted from what the land provided, often in just a few hours before nightfall. The frontiersmen were masters of improvisation. They didn't carry much with them, so they had to look around: trees, branches, bark, leaves, moss, even snow, and envision a structure. A common choice was the lean-to, a simple but effective design built by leaning sticks against a horizontal support beam, which was tied between two trees. The structure was then layered with brush, bark, or leaves to create insulation and protection from rain or wind. But it wasn't just about throwing sticks together. These shelters were carefully planned. Location mattered immensely. A spot too close to a river could flood or attract predators. Too exposed, and the wind would cut through like knives. A seasoned frontiersman would scout for natural features: a rock face, a fallen log, a thicket, to provide part of the shelter or act as a windbreak. Then there was the insulation. In cold climates, simply having a roof wasn't enough. They would pile up pine needles, ferns, or dry leaves between layers of bark to trap heat. Some even built debris huts, structures entirely buried under layers of leaves and branches, designed to retain body warmth in freezing temperatures. Inside, the space was tight on purpose. The smaller the area, the easier it was to keep warm. The skill of building shelter also required an understanding of time and energy. A frontiersman had to decide: should I spend hours making a solid shelter and risk darkness falling before it's done? Or make a quick, temporary one to just get through the night and improve it tomorrow? These were real-time, survival-driven decisions made daily. In places where materials were scarce, like open plains or deserts, creativity became even more crucial. A clump of bushes might be hollowed out for a quick hideaway. Rocks might be stacked to form wind barriers. Even animal hides or clothes were sometimes stretched across branches to form a basic roof. What's most impressive is how efficiently they worked. A trained frontiersman could walk into an unfamiliar environment and, within hours, have a shelter that kept out wind, shed rain, and retained warmth, all without nails, glue, or blueprints. Their knowledge of materials, how birch bark sheds water, how spruce boughs cushion and insulate, how certain vines can bind like rope, was born from experience, not books. Building a shelter wasn't just about comfort. It was about creating a sense of security in an unpredictable world. Each shelter was a fortress against nature's fury, a place where a fire could be lit, food could be eaten, and a few precious hours of sleep could be found before the next day's struggle began. To survive in the wilderness without modern stores or medicine, frontiersmen had to become living encyclopedias of the natural world. One of their most vital skills was the ability to identify edible and medicinal plants, a knowledge set that, in today's world, has nearly vanished. In the forest, food wasn't packaged and medicine wasn't bottled. Everything came from the earth, and knowing what to eat, or what not to eat, could mean the difference between health and illness, nourishment or poisoning. Frontiersmen spent years learning which plants were safe to consume. They knew which berries were sweet and nutritious and which ones were toxic. For example, they could easily tell the difference between edible blackberries and dangerous lookalikes like nightshade. Mushrooms, which could be a rich source of protein, were approached with extreme caution because a single mistake could be fatal. So they didn't just rely on sight. They understood the season, habitat, color, smell, and even how animals interacted with certain plants before trusting them. But this skill went far beyond food. Nature was also their pharmacy. Long before over-the-counter medicines, they used roots, barks, and leaves to treat wounds, reduce fevers, and fight infections. They knew that the inner bark of the willow tree contained compounds similar to aspirin and was used to relieve pain and inflammation. Yarrow was crushed into poultices to stop bleeding. Plantain leaves were chewed and applied to insect bites to relieve itching and swelling. Even tree sap had its uses. The resin from pine trees could be heated into a sticky antiseptic that sealed cuts and prevented infection. Elderberries were brewed into teas that helped with colds and flu-like symptoms. Mint and wild ginger soothed upset stomachs. These remedies weren't based on guesswork. They were the result of generations of observation, trial and error, and sometimes hard lessons learned through suffering. Gathering the wrong plant didn't just risk illness. It could drain precious time and energy. So frontiersmen learned to observe plant characteristics with intense focus. Leaf shape, vein patterns, stem textures, and the way a plant responded when crushed or exposed to flame. This level of familiarity allowed them to create makeshift meals when hunting failed, or to treat injuries when no help was available for miles. They also preserved this knowledge by teaching it orally, passing it down through family lines, or sharing tips with fellow travelers. In isolated cabins or on long expeditions, these skills kept people alive during harsh winters or after injuries when formal help wasn't an option. Often, the success of a hunting trip or the recovery from illness hinged on having the right leaf, the right root, at the right time. This wasn't just survival. It was a deep, respectful partnership with the land. The frontiersman didn't just see a field of plants. He saw a map of nutrition, medicine, and opportunity. Every forest, meadow, or swamp had something to offer, if you knew where to look and what to look for. In the days of the frontiersmen, getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it was life-threatening. There were no roads, no signs, and certainly no digital maps or compasses for everyday use. Survival depended heavily on the ability to navigate vast, wild landscapes using only the stars, the sun, and the clues nature provided. This wasn't a backup plan. It was their primary method of finding their way through unknown territories. One of the most reliable tools in their arsenal was the night sky. Frontiersmen understood the stars intimately, especially the North Star, Polaris, which always pointed toward true north in the northern hemisphere. By locating the Big Dipper and tracing a line through its pointer stars, they could find Polaris and orient themselves even in complete darkness. This simple knowledge gave them a sense of direction that modern people often take for granted. During the day, they relied on the position of the sun. By tracking where it rose and set, they could estimate direction and even time. If the sun was overhead, casting a shadow directly beneath them, they knew it was noon. If it was low and to the right, they were likely heading north. If it was to the left, they were heading south. Some frontiersmen even made makeshift sun compasses using sticks and shadows, tools crafted from nothing more than instinct and survival logic. But their navigation skills didn't stop at celestial bodies. The natural environment was filled with subtle signs that offered valuable direction. They knew that moss tends to grow on the north side of trees in the northern hemisphere due to the lack of direct sunlight. Anthills were often built on the south side of trees where the sun was stronger, and tree bark was thicker and more textured on the north-facing side. These were tiny indicators, but when used together, they painted a reliable picture of orientation. Animal behavior also served as a natural compass. Birds often flew in predictable patterns during migration seasons. Deer trails could lead to water sources, which in turn could guide a traveler toward settlements or lower elevations. Frontiersmen paid attention to the direction of prevailing winds, the angle of spider webs, the tilt of snow drifts, and even the way ice formed on streams. All of these natural patterns, observed over time, gave them a mental map of the world around them. They also recognized landmarks, distinctive rock formations, tall trees, river bends, not only to navigate forward but to find their way back. Some would subtly mark trees with carvings or broken branches to create trails that only they could recognize. This was especially important during hunting trips or while scouting unfamiliar areas, where returning to camp was just as crucial as venturing out. Navigation, for frontiersmen, wasn't just a practical skill, it was a mindset. It required patience, awareness, and a deep connection to the environment. They didn't simply walk from point A to point B. They read the world as they moved through it, constantly gathering information and adjusting their course. This skill kept them from wandering into danger, wasting time, or getting stranded in harsh conditions, and it allowed them to explore new territories with confidence. For the frontiersmen, survival in the wilderness meant living off the land, not just occasionally, but daily. And at the heart of that lifestyle was a deep mastery of hunting and trapping. These weren't hobbies or weekend skills. They were essential, hard-earned abilities that fed families, fueled long journeys, and maintained strength through brutal winters. Without supermarkets or supply lines, the rifle, bow, or trap was as crucial as the axe or fire starter. Hunting wasn't simply about tracking down a deer and pulling the trigger. It was a combination of observation, patience, skill, and endurance. A seasoned frontiersman would wake before dawn, moving silently through brush or snow to avoid spooking game. He would know the migration paths of elk, the feeding grounds of wild turkeys, the watering habits of deer, and the territorial patterns of bears. Every region had its own wildlife, and the frontiersmen studied them like students learning a craft. They learned to walk downwind, so animals wouldn't catch their scent. They knew how to step without snapping twigs, how to freeze at the slightest sound, and how to blend into the environment with handmade camouflage. Their weapons, whether muskets, bows, or slingshots, were extensions of their body, carefully maintained and handled with quiet precision. But when hunting failed, they turned to the art of trapping, which required a completely different set of skills. Trapping wasn't about the chase, it was about knowledge and planning. Frontiersmen would set dozens of traps at once, using snares, deadfalls, and steel traps positioned along animal trails, near dens, or close to water sources. A well-placed trap could catch rabbits, foxes, beavers, or even larger animals depending on the bait and mechanism used. Each trap had to be tailored for the specific prey. For rabbits, they might use a simple spring snare made from pliable branches and cordage. For raccoons, they'd place shiny objects or food inside box traps. Beavers required baited underwater snares, strategically positioned along dams or feeding spots. The traps had to be camouflaged, scent masked, and regularly checked, not just to retrieve the animal, but to ensure it didn't spoil or get stolen by scavengers. Beyond the kill, frontiersmen were skilled in the butchering, preserving, and using every part of the animal. Meat was smoked, dried into jerky, or boiled. Skins were tanned into clothing or shelter material. Bones became tools or weapons. Nothing was wasted. Even the fat was rendered into tallow for candles or cooking. This complete use of the animal reflected a deep respect for nature and a no-waste mindset, one that came not from idealism, but necessity. There was also a mental challenge to this life. Hunting and trapping weren't always successful. Days could pass without a single catch, especially during bad weather or in overhunted areas. In those moments, frontiersmen had to fall back on stored food, edible plants, or alternative protein sources like insects or small birds. They couldn't afford frustration or panic. Adaptability and resilience were just as important as skill. Moreover, these survivalists understood the seasonal rhythms of the land. Spring brought birds and fresh game. Summer meant fattened animals and abundant fish. Autumn was for preparing meat for storage. Winter was harsh and lean, demanding strategy and conservation. Each month dictated what could be hunted, how, and where. This wasn't recreational sport. It was life at its most primal. And for the frontiersmen, it was a constant reminder that every meal was earned, not by money or trade, but by knowledge, effort, and a steady hand. Water may seem abundant in the wilderness, flowing rivers, still ponds, and glistening snow all around. But for the frontiersmen, finding and purifying safe drinking water was a critical, daily survival task. Clean water was not just about quenching thirst, it was about preventing disease, maintaining energy, and ensuring long-term survival. A single misstep, drinking from a contaminated source, could lead to deadly consequences like dysentery, cholera, or parasites, which were often more lethal than hunger or predators. The frontiersmen became experts at reading the landscape to locate the most reliable water sources. They understood that fast-moving water in streams and rivers was generally safer than stagnant pools, which could harbor bacteria and insects. They avoided water near animal tracks, carcasses, or beaver dams, warning signs of contamination. Instead, they followed signs like bird flight paths, lush vegetation, or even insect activity like bees, which often led to hidden springs or freshwater sources. In mountainous or forested regions, they searched for natural springs, often found near the base of hills where underground water pushed to the surface. In drier areas, they dug into dry creek beds or collected dew using cloths in the early morning hours. They even collected rainwater, funneling it with bark, leaves, or hollowed-out logs, and sometimes used snow or ice during winter, but only after melting it, since eating snow directly could dangerously lower body temperature and accelerate dehydration. But sourcing water was only half the battle. Purification was just as essential. Long before modern filters or purification tablets, frontiersmen used primitive but effective methods to make water safe. One of the most common was boiling. They would build a fire, fill a metal pot or container with water, and let it boil for several minutes to kill pathogens. If metal pots weren't available, they heated rocks in the fire and dropped them into water held in bark or leather containers, a slow but effective way to bring water to a near boil without destroying the container. They also developed natural filtration systems. By layering sand, charcoal, and gravel in a hollowed-out log or cloth bag, they created rudimentary filters that removed sediment and some impurities. Charcoal, in particular, was prized for its ability to absorb toxins and reduce foul odors. In some regions, they even used certain plants, like the stems of reeds or moss, to help filter water slowly. When boiling wasn't possible, they sometimes relied on chemical purification using natural sources, like adding tiny amounts of wood ash or crushed seeds from certain plants that helped settle debris and neutralize bacteria. Others used the sun to their advantage, leaving water in clear containers to solar purify over several hours, a method surprisingly effective in killing microbes, though not always available or fast. Perhaps even more impressive was how frontiersmen learned to ration and conserve water during long treks or in times of scarcity. They drank in small sips, avoided salty or overly dry foods, and timed their travel to cooler parts of the day to reduce sweating. In emergencies, they extracted moisture from plants like cactus, grapevines, or certain tree roots, and in some cases even constructed solar stills, where the heat of the sun would evaporate moisture from leaves or soil, then collect it as condensed water on a covering surface. This constant vigilance toward hydration was not a luxury. It was a matter of survival. Dehydration could set in quickly, affecting mental clarity, motor skills, and decision-making, all dangerous liabilities in the wild. That's why frontiersmen often prioritized finding and purifying water before anything else, even before shelter or fire. Because without safe water, no other survival skill could sustain them for long. When you're alone in the wilderness, shelter isn't just about comfort, it's about survival. The frontiersmen knew this deeply. Whether they were caught in a sudden storm, trapped by snowfall, or facing blistering heat, their first priority was often to create a protective shelter using only what nature provided. These early explorers and settlers didn't always have tents or cabins ready for them. They had to rely on resourcefulness, observation, and hands-on skill to craft structures that could shield them from the elements, wild animals, and even other humans. The design of a shelter depended heavily on the environment and the season. In forested regions, fallen branches, logs, and leaves became the basic building blocks. In open plains, they might use tall grass, sod, or even dig outs. Holes in the earth reinforced with whatever materials they could find. In snowy conditions, some frontiersmen built snow caves or insulated lean-tos that held body heat surprisingly well. The key was knowing what worked where and how to build fast, especially when weather turned suddenly. One of the most common forms was the lean-to, built by angling large branches against a fallen log or standing support, then layering smaller sticks and piling on leaves, moss, or pine boughs for insulation. This simple structure could be assembled quickly, offering protection from wind and rain. More complex versions included debris huts, which were dome-like structures made from a framework of bent saplings covered with thick vegetation, designed to trap warmth and keep out the cold. In wetter climates, they raised their shelters off the ground using logs or stones to avoid moisture and creeping insects. They also paid attention to the direction of wind and rain, always building with the entrance facing away from prevailing weather and choosing ground that was slightly elevated to avoid flooding. The ground itself was often insulated with layers of dried leaves, bark, or animal hides to prevent heat loss during sleep. Materials were chosen not just for availability, but for their specific properties. Birch bark was prized for its water resistance and was often used for roofing. Pine branches were used for bedding or insulation. Clay or mud could be applied over gaps to act as a windbreak. In treeless regions, frontiersmen learned to construct stone windbreaks or dig shelters directly into the side of hills for natural insulation. Some even built log cabins from scratch, notched and stacked by hand, using mud or moss to seal the cracks. Every shelter had to be efficient, fast to construct, and reliable, especially when daylight was short and temperatures were dropping. Time was often limited, so frontiersmen had to make split-second decisions about location and materials. They learned to read the terrain quickly, avoiding spots near rivers that could flood, under trees that might drop branches, or in open spaces that offered no protection from wind. Fire also played a key role in shelter building. They designed shelters with fire pits positioned strategically, allowing heat to radiate inward without filling the structure with smoke. Some even constructed reflector walls from stone or logs behind the fire, which bounced heat toward the sleeping area. Maintaining warmth through cold nights could mean the difference between waking up refreshed or not waking at all. But shelter wasn't just about battling the weather. It was a psychological anchor. After a long day of tracking game or navigating unknown terrain, having a place, even a primitive one, to rest, to cook, to regroup, gave frontiersmen a sense of security and order in a chaotic environment. It allowed them to plan, to recover, and to survive another day. And these shelters, rough as they were, stood as symbols of human resilience, proof that even in the wildest corners of the world, man could carve out a small piece of safety with his bare hands and a knowledge of the land.